Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're starting our coverage of the 2017 Champions Showdown held in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm going to give a quick intro into how the showdown is structured, and then we'll look at one of the matches from day one. There's 8 competitors, and each competitor is matched up against one individual opponent. I'll go ahead and give you the matchups right now. Nakamura will be faced off against Topalov, Fabiano Caruana against Alexander Grishuk, Wesley So versus Leonid Dominguez, and Magnus Carlsen versus Ding Lian. And those are going to be their opponents the entire format. They're going to play 30 games against their opponent over a 4-day stretch. The first 3 matchups I mentioned will play from Thursday to Sunday, and Magnus Carlsen will kick off on Saturday, and Carlsen and Ding Lian will play from Saturday through Tuesday. We'll have as much coverage as possible, but playing 30 games against each of your opponent or against your individual opponent means you're going to have to play some pretty quick matches. Instead of these 4-hour marathon sessions, they're going to be playing rapid and blitz chess. 30 games in total, 10 games of rapid chess. Rapid just means anywhere from 10 to 60 minutes, and 20 games of blitz chess, meaning games of less than 10 minutes. This is a format very different than others where there's no time increment added after you play. There's also no delay, meaning your clock is going to start immediately when it is your turn. On day one, you'll be playing your opponent 4 games of 30-minute increments. So imagine you have 30 total minutes for the game. On day 2, you'll be playing 6 games of 20 minutes. Day 3, 8 games of 10 minutes, and on the last day, 12 games of 5-minute blitz chess. At the end of that, there's different points awarded for wins on each of the days. At the end of 4 days, if you have the most points, you will win $60,000. If you lose, you will win $40,000. If there's a tie, they will split that. So you're just playing one opponent. Doesn't matter if you win every single game. You're not going to win any more or less than someone else that wins their heads-up matchup against their opponent. So you really get to get a good sense of what your opponent is trying to do over time. And as you can imagine, as things progress and maybe one person is down a few wins, you start to see more aggression and some lines that maybe if they were ahead or tied, they may not go down those. But things get pretty crazy once we get into some of the later rapid and especially the blitz game. So that is the format that we will be going over the next week. We'll try to have as much analysis as possible so that you guys can see as much of the coverage. The first game we're going to be looking at is between the Cuban Grandmaster Leonid Dominguez and the American Wesley So, one of the top players in the world currently. This is the 4th game on day 1. The first 3 games they played were all a draw. And while you don't have to win any of the games since you play 30 in total, both sides looking to end day 1 on a strong note. So we'll go ahead and get started. White plays pawn e4. Wesley So continues pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez, and the defense of the Berlin defense, knight to f6. Some people refer to this as the Berlin Wall. And this mirrors a lot of the games they played up until this point, from games 1 through 3, as well as a lot of the other competitors against their opponents playing the Berlin defense. And if you've been following chess tournaments that I've covered over the past few years, this tends to be one of the most popular defenses that we see for players starting with pawn to e4, straight getting into the Ruy Lopez and then the Berlin defense. A lot of ways that white can continue. He can castle on the king side if he wants to, or decide to play more of a quiet pawn to d3, solidifying his pawn chain. He does have his light square bishop outside this pawn chain, so he can go and solidify, get his dark square bishop involved, get his knight involved, castle on the king side. Have a safe game. Don't have to get into anything too crazy right now. Black plays bishop down here, c5, and then knight to c3. And this is probably what I would consider a safe play. He does have the option of bishop to e3. And so if Wesley So now decides to exchange, you can recapture, though he does have a double pawn here. This is going to be fine. He's controlling in the center of the board, and it's going to be easy for him to exchange at some point and no longer have a doubled up pawn structure here on the e-file. This also opens up, if there's pawn to d6, castle on the king side. His rook here on f1 is a very aggressive square. It's a semi-open file, can really start to attack the king side of the board. board, but this does open up some risk for white. He has a weakened king side since there's not an extra pawn in front of him, and he does have to maneuver to make sure that he gets the pawn away from the double pawn structure here on the e-file. So all things considered, right now he decides to play knight to c3. I would imagine as we progress into some later blitz games that on day 3 and 4, we will see more aggressive lines like a bishop to e3. Also, if Dominguez was down games, I think he would try to play more aggressive lines. With it being tied right now, doesn't need to do anything too crazy. So knight to c3, castle on the king side, bishop takes on c6, pawn recaptures on c6, pawn to h3. So both sides playing what I would consider normal main book lines. Knight can't come down to g4 right now, so stopping that. Rook to e8, and then bishop to e3. Not a lot of great squares for the bishop could come to. Could come up here to g5 if we wanted to pin down the knight, but decides to first go ahead and say, hey, Wesley, so do you want to exchange material right here? If he does exchange, you could also see Dominguez castle on the queen side and have some open files for both of his rooks to attack on the king side. Wesley So decides that's not the path he wants to go down. He's already committed to castling on one side of the board, and so if you have this exchange, it tends to favor some aggression from white. So he decides to bring his bishop back here to d6. He has the double bishop, wants to hold on to that advantage right now. Knight back here to e2. Interesting move to go ahead and start bringing your knight over to the king side of the board, but entire strategies are changing just on simple moves right here. So he would have played completely different if there was an exchange, but with the bishop coming back to d6, decides let's go ahead and maneuver my knight over to the king side of the board. Pawn to c5, knight here to g3, and then pawn a5. Says, okay, if you're going to start maneuvering to the king side, I'm going to start attacking the queen side of the board. White decides to go ahead and stop that attack on the queen side, pawns a4, and you'll probably be doing this a lot in your own games. They play pawn h5 on the king side, pawn a5 on the queen side. You don't want them to push you any further. It just makes life difficult as you're trying to develop your pawns or your pieces. So pawn a4, stopping that. Knight here to d7, allowing him a few options. He could come to b8 and then c6. He could come f8 and then e6 to maneuver, control the center of the board. Knight up here, f5, and then he chooses to go with the knight to f8 path. Knight down here, d2, and both sides really just maneuvering their knights around the center of the board, trying to get to a better position based on how their pawn structures are set up. And this is giving Wesley So an option here. He has the double pawns here on the c-file. If he wanted to exchange his bishop, he could and not have to worry about that double pawns here, but decides he wants to hold on to his double bishops and not give that away. And this particular spot, Dominguez feels something on the board that he wants to take advantage of. And this is probably the place where, Black has the most passive setup on the board. Both of his bishops are on the 8th rank right now. His knight on the board really isn't doing a ton by itself here, and he has a very active position with both of his knights in the center, bishop here on e3. He can get his queen involved into the game very easily, so he decides to go ahead and play pawn to g4. Very aggressive, starting to attack the king side of the board. His opponent's already blinked and that he's castled on one side of the board, so it's going to be very easy for Dominguez to castle on the queen side, start to throw everything he wants at the king side of the board. His opponent doesn't know where white's going to castle. He still has different options. So if Wesley So decided to throw everything at the queen side of the board, he could still castle on the king side, wouldn't be as protected, but he figures he's playing the white pieces. He has an advantage. He wants to push that as much as possible. And he looks at some of his other options. He plays bishop to d2, maybe now knight down here d4. That's one of the reasons you play knight to e6, and then you take, there's a recapture. Maybe you want to take the knight up here on the pawn here on a5. Your bishop is protecting that. Part of the reason we brought the bishop back here to d2. Maybe queen down here, h4, you castle. It just gets tricky as far as your opponent maybe have a perpetual check here. Some of the safer options don't tend to end up in the spot that Dominguez probably wanted to get to. So he decides his best route is to play pawn to g4 and be as aggressive as possible. Wesley So responds with knight down here to d4, pawn up c3, forcing the knight to move. Knight takes back here on f5. And if you say, well, why doesn't the knight take? it's probably worse for the knight to take here on d4, because then the pawn's going to take. This pawn here on d4 is just putting so much pressure on the opponent. Black is really controlling the center of the board. The bishop's forced to move. Now pawn to b6 can get the light square bishop involved into the center of the board. I think this is going to be worse for white, so decides let's not deal with that. Instead, let's go ahead and try to kick that knight away. After he does that, now pawn takes on f5, and this kind of signals in my mind that if he's opening up the king side of the board, he's really looking to castle on the queen side, really start to control the king side of the board with his rooks on these semi-open files. Pawn to c6. Queen here to c2, pawn down here b5. So knowing that white could be castling on the queen side, Wesley So starts to throw everything he can at the queen side of the board. Knight comes back here to d2. Pawn g6, interesting move from Wesley So, saying I'm okay stopping some of your attack even if it weakens my king side of the board. And then the pawn takes here on g6. I don't think white has to take here. He has some other options. He could castle on the queen side of the board right away. He could play knight to f3. I don't really think that his opponent's going to take here with f5 because you could castle on the king side. You could take back right away. You could start with a check here on g1. This really opens up the door for an attack. So I think you can save the pawn takes on g6 and develop some other pieces to give you a better spot. But Dominguez decides, I'm going to go ahead and capture this material right here. We see the recapture and then castle on the queen side exactly as we expected. Now the pawn takes on a4. Then up here to c4. Could decide to go ahead and take it right away, but says, you know what, I'm going to get this material back. My opponent can't really hold on to that material, so this is fine. I'm going to go ahead and play first, knight to c4. Wesley So plays pawn to a3. He recognizes that this pawn is going to fall, so all he wants to do is try to get an isolated pawn over here, not allow his opponent to have a better pawn structure. So sometimes if you are going to lose material, it's best just to see if you can put a damper in your opponent's plans. That's what he does with pawn to a3. Rook over here to b8, also allowing him the opportunity to have control of this b file. And so this ends up giving Wesley So something back for that exchange. But Wesley So really needs to be aggressive. He has all of his material on the 8th rank. Dominguez has a better position as far as his material in the center of the board and where he is attacking. So right now I would give a slight advantage to Dominguez. Pawn up here, h4, says right now I got to throw everything at the king side of the board. I've castled on the queen side. You're going to start to attack on the queen side. My best option is the king side. Bishop down here, g4 attacking the rook. Rook to g1, probably where white wanted to go anyway. Bishop back, h5, and this really puts a stop to a lot of what white wanted to do. He'd have to bring his knight over here to really kick this bishop off. This dark square bishop's not going to be kicking it off, so great little square for Wesley So to stop an attack. Rook here to g3, bishop down here to e7, attacking the pawn. This really just keeps the rook here on h1 from doing too much as far as going away. It has to protect that. Bishop to g5 says, hey, let's exchange if you want to. Wesley So is not having any of that. Pawn to f6. Bishop comes back here to e3. King h7. Rook here to g1. Black's just making sure that his king is not on the same file that his opponent is just doubling up all of his rooks and his material on. Queen here to d7, pawn up here to f4, rook to d8. So both sides really just maneuvering around the board, trying to find the best position that both sides can really start to attack their opponents. A bishop down here to d2, and had some other options if you wanted to try pawn takes on e5. This does open up some of the board state, but decides instead to go ahead and play bishop down here to d2. Pawn takes on e4. Now the bishop recaptures. Rook here to b7, and then queen over here to g2. So throwing everything he can over on the king side of the board. You know, he had material that he could have even taken. Knight takes on a5 if he wants to. Rook down here, b5, going to be pretty easy. Just rook or knight back here to c4, but decides, you know what, there's such a big attack going on the king side of the board, I'm going to go ahead and play queen to g2. Wesley So plays rook to g8, recognizing a strong attack is starting on the king side, wants to protect that. Queen to h3 just says, hey, if you want to exchange queens on board, I'm fine with that. There's an exchange. Rook takes on h3. So as soon as queen comes off the board, you start to see both sides recognizing their kings really become a valuable asset in the game, and you really don't want them to be on the outskirts of the game. You want them to be in the center. They control a lot of the board. It does become somewhat difficult when your opponents have double bishops. Both of their rooks, if they're connected and there's open files, they can start to attack. So both sides are going to be looking at ways that they can get their king without getting into a strong attack. Pawn to a4 says, hey, you were attacking it with your knight. You didn't take it before, so I'm going to try to hold on to that material right now. This does also open up the ability for the rook to come down to b3 if it wants to, because the outpost from the pawn here on a4. King to g7, rook here to g3, just doubling up on the semi-open file on the g file. King here f7, just centralizing. Knight to a5, attacking the rook. Rook here to b6. Knight back here to c4. Both sides doing a good job in this rapid game with only 30 minutes. They've both played solid chess. Both put their opponents in some situations where they can make mistakes. And both sides are really making the best decisions along the way. Few things that, that they could have maneuvered or gave them slightly better position. But these guys have prepared for this tournament for months now, and so there's a good reason why they're playing what they're doing, and they also have scouting reports on their opponents. They know what their opponents like to do, and so we're seeing some great chess, which is always exciting in these fast games to see how their minds works. They don't have hours to think about these different moves. They're doing it sometimes in a matter of seconds. Rook back here to b7 since it's no longer attacked. Bishop up here d6 says, yeah, I'll go ahead and exchange if you want to. Wesley So decides I'm not ready to do that right away. We do see an exchange with the bishops right now. I think that's good for white. It doesn't have to worry about the two bishops on board. But I would say getting into the in-game, Wesley So still has the better minor piece. Knight's usually best if there's pawns on one side of the board because he can really just control all that. But if there's pawns all over, bishops tend to do better because they can control all of the board. All of the board, they can get there very, very quickly. White's perspective, he wants to make sure that he doesn't have all of his pawns and material on light squares. If his material is not on light squares, this light square bishop tends to not do too much. He can block off some of the squares that he can go to, but as far as attacking the pieces, doesn't have to worry about that. Rook here to f1. Starting to attack. These rooks are kind of a nuisance for black to have to worry about. His bishop's tied down here. Right now, the king or the rooks are going to have to be dealing with that. So white's being more aggressive, I would say, and black's right now just has to be defensive. Rook to e3 says if he wants to push forward in the center of the board. Rook over here to b8, since it's no longer attacking as much, decides this may be my only opportunity to start to double down and start to attack on the king side or the queen side of the board for white. You can see how valuable this knight here on c4 is. It stops a lot of the squares that black would want to go to on his own side of the board, but as well, if the rook wants to come down to b2, he can't, even though he's doubled up because of the knight, as well as the rook here on the first rank, stopping the rook coming down here to b1. So white doing a good job stopping a lot of attacks that black would want to do. And it's not easy for black to kick this knight off. Yes, it is on a light square and he has a light square bishop, but how does he easily get this light square bishop over there to kick it off? Doesn't do it very easily. Rook here to g1. Knight here to d7. We do see some repetition in moves, but rook here to g3, making sure that there's not a threefold repetition. Doesn't want to have a draw here. Rook here to b7 comes back, and we do see that repeat once. But then we decide to change that up so there's no draw. Rook here to b1 says, let's exchange on board if you want to. That's exactly what we see happen. Wesley So decides this is my best opportunity to get this bishop down here to d1. And so that's exactly what happens. King here, c1, bishop up here, b3 says, okay, now I can get this knight off the board if I want to, or off the square here on c4. Knight back here, d2, attacking the bishop. Pawn down here, c4, just extending the pressure on his opponent. Decides to go ahead and take that. Rook over here to b7 says, yeah, you're up a pawn to material, but it's a double pawn. I think I can get that back, so I'm not too worried about it right now. I'm going to go ahead and bring my rook over here to b7. Now white decides to go ahead and start to force black's hand a little bit and attack his pawns over here on the king side of the board. Rook here to g3 says, I'm going to attack your pawn on a g6. Rook over here to h7. So yeah, forces his hand a little bit. Says, I'm going to attack your pawn. If you want to take mine, I'll take yours as well. Knight here to f3. So positioning, recognizing that stuff's about to happen on the king side. Not too worried about this pawn. As we said before, it's going to be difficult to hold on to the double pawns. So just says, hey, I'll give you that pawn if you want to. I want to start to attack this king side of the board, protect my pawn first and foremost here on h4. Bishop takes on c4 as expected. Now the rook takes on g6. But then we see an interesting move of bishop to d3. And really, we needed a king to f7. That probably makes the most sense of forcing the rook back here. I still like white's position either way. I think this entire exchange on how it went down is better for white. But you have to play the king to f7 here. The problem is, after bishop to d3, you're not just going to get this material back. It's not that easy. White has the move, knight to g5, and this is a huge dagger, forking the king and the rook here on h7. The pawn can't recapture because it's being pinned down by the rook here on g6. A move Wesley So, no doubt if he had more time, would find. But in a rapid game, he just didn't see this. And immediately after this move, he was forced to resign. So great game. Dominguez, I would consider this a huge upset. Wesley So being one of the top players in the world right now. And he's just been on a tear the past year and a half, pretty much beating everyone in his way. Wesley So falls to Dominguez. And so after 4 games, Dominguez goes into day 2 with a game in hand. So we'll be looking to continue that run as they play some more rapid games on day 2. So a lot of exciting chess going on. For day 2, we will be covering a couple games. Day 1, did want to have an overview so you're familiar with how the tournament starts, but we will be having multiple games as far as coverage goes. So be sure and check back. But thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.